Well, I'm now joined from Sheffield by Professor John Lee, who's a former professor of pathology and consultant pathologist with the NHS. Let me turn to you first, Professor Lee. You really don't believe in lockdowns. You think they're pointless. Why?
Well, I think at the very beginning of the epidemic, in March, there were genuine reasons for concern. But I think for several months now, it's been clear that this virus is not the new plague that it was feared that it would be. And yet we've continued to act as if it is that new plague. We've also continued to act in this way despite major harms caused by lockdowns and despite very little evidence that lockdowns, social distancing, masks and all the other things that have been introduced actually work on a societal basis. So we're actually causing more harm, clearly causing more harm, both in terms of deaths and in terms of quality of life by the actions we're taking for a virus, for a disease that's within the envelope of many years within the last 30 years.
And yet, Professor Lee, in this country right now, cases are rising exponentially. So how do you stop the cases rising if you don't have a lockdown? Because the knock-on effect is we get more hospitalisations, more people ICU, more pressures on our health service, and eventually it won't be able to cope.
Well, I mean, my argument is if your health service or any health service isn't up to providing the care that's needed, you should increase capacity. What you shouldn't do is imprison your entire population and do epidemiological and virological experiments on people which don't have any way of being verified, which don't have any evidence to support them, and cause, as I say, cause great harms. There's also a problem that in this phase of the pandemic, people have equated positive tests with cases. Now, this isn't correct. This is simply wrong. In a normal winter, we never obsessively test the population for any virus to the extent to which this virus is being tested for. And the fact is, if you have a positive test but you're not unwell, you cannot be regarded as a case of this disease. You're just somebody who's got a virus. The only people who in a normal winter turn up as cases of this disease are people who are admitted to hospital, people who become seriously ill. And they're a very tiny proportion of the number of positive tests that you would do if you tested everybody. So the fact is that for people under 70, the infection fatality rate for this disease is 0.05%, which is about half of flu. And it's likely to be even lower than that because, of course, we don't truly know what the denominator is because we haven't been testing in the wider population. And many of the tests that have been done, the antibody tests, are the wrong tests to be doing because we should be testing people's T cells, which would show that a lot of people already have pre-existing resistance to this virus. So on very many levels, the approach to this virus, both scientifically and medically, but also in terms of societally, what we're doing with this is simply wrong. My view is that we should have no more lockdown. We should go back to living lives normally. We should travel normally. We should go to work. We should go out. And people who are vulnerable, people who are at risk of disease, the elderly, if they want to, they could be advised to look after themselves. But frankly, if I'm 70 or if I'm 80, I don't want to have many of the things that make life worth living taken away from me by government and government responses that infantilise the population and tell us that we can't make risk assessments for ourselves as we go about our daily lives.
OK, just before I bring in my other guests, I have to come back to you on that, though, Professor Lee, and that would inevitably lead to people losing their lives, people who are vulnerable and people who are elderly. Surely that's not acceptable.
Well, you're saying that nobody should die. I mean, we need to be able to have a grown-up conversation about death in our societies. The fact is, when you get to in your 80s, you have a high chance of dying of all diseases. In the UK, at least, the average age of death is about 82. The average age of death of COVID is a bit older than the average age of death. So the fact is, there's no evidence that COVID is really impacting on the overall lifespan of the population. Yes, certain people are more susceptible to this disease, and it can obviously cause a nasty disease. But the fact is, this societal response is something that has never been done before. There are many diseases that kill millions of people a year. You know, tuberculosis, malaria, AIDS, influenza itself, all cause more than 1 million deaths a year. This year we'll have some COVID deaths, which will be more than 1 million worldwide. But the fact is there are 70 million deaths every year, and next year we will have many fewer COVID deaths. I come back to the point, at the beginning of this pandemic, people were worried that this was a very severe, very serious virus, a new plague. It isn't. It's quite clear that the infection fatality rate is comparable with flu. You can argue about whether it's a bit more or a bit less, but basically it's not a lot more, even in the vulnerable groups. And in many groups of younger people, it's a lot lower. So the fact is, this is not the new plague. This is a virus, as I say, which is within the envelope of winter deaths that we've dealt with for
Okay.
many years out of the last 30 and for many, many years out of the last 100.
Okay,
We've never
Ryan.
done this before. This is a societal experiment and it's the wrong thing to do.
Ryan.